The morning mist hung low over the Norman hedgerows, thick enough to blur the outlines of the shattered orchard beyond the road. From a distance, the countryside looked almost peaceful, the pale gray sky stretching over fields that had once held cattle and wheat before the war arrived. But the quiet did not last long in Normandy in the summer of 1944. Beneath the mist, engines were already moving. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow line, German armor had begun to roll forward, their tracks grinding slowly through the damp soil as commanders pushed their counterattacks toward the Allied lodgment. And among the British units holding the thin defensive line that morning, there was a belief repeated so often it had almost become an accepted fact. No British gun could stop a Tiger tank from the front. The Tiger had already earned its reputation across Europe and North Africa. Its thick armor, powerful 88mm gun, and imposing silhouette had turned it into something more than just another armored vehicle in the minds of soldiers. It was a symbol of German armored superiority. British tank crews had learned that confronting it head-on usually ended the same way. Their shells would strike the frontal armor and shatter or ricochet harmlessly away, while the Tiger's own gun could destroy an Allied tank from well over 1,000 yards. For infantry units caught in the open, the sight of a Tiger advancing across a field often meant there was little to do but scatter and pray artillery or air support arrived in time. By the time the Normandy campaign began, stories about the Tiger had spread through every Allied formation fighting in France. Some were exaggerated, as battlefield rumors often were, but the core truth remained hard to ignore. The Tiger was one of the most dangerous armored machines in the war. And yet that morning, hidden behind a line of thick hedgerows not far from the village of Tilly-sur-Seulles, a British gun crew was preparing to challenge that belief. Their weapon did not look particularly remarkable at first glance. It lacked the intimidating size of the Tiger's gun and the armored protection of a tank turret. Instead, it sat low against the ground behind a camouflage net, its long barrel pointing through a narrow gap cut in the hedge. The weapon was the British 17-pounder anti-tank gun, one of the most powerful anti-armor weapons developed by the Allies during the war. But even within British ranks there had been skepticism about it. Early in the war, British anti-tank guns had struggled against increasingly heavy German armor. The development of the 17-pounder had been a desperate response to that growing problem. Engineers had designed it to fire a high-velocity armor-piercing shell capable of penetrating even the thick plating of the newest German tanks. In theory, it could defeat a Tiger. In practice, very few soldiers had yet seen that happen from the front. The gun crew waiting behind the hedgerow knew the reputation of the Tiger as well as anyone. They had heard the same stories repeated in mess tents and supply depots. Some of them had seen Tigers before, watched them appear suddenly through the smoke of battle and destroy British armor with frightening efficiency. Their commander, a young lieutenant barely older than the men he led, understood exactly what they were facing. Intelligence reports had warned that elements of a German heavy tank battalion were operating in the area, attempting to push Allied forces back toward the beaches. The British line that morning was thin, and if the German armor broke through, the consequences could be severe. The gun had been placed carefully the night before, its position chosen with patience and experience. The hedgerows of Normandy formed natural defensive barriers, their thick earthen banks and tangled vegetation creating narrow lanes where tanks had little room to maneuver. If the Germans attacked along the road ahead, they would have to expose themselves briefly as they crossed an opening between two fields. That was the moment the gun crew was waiting for. The men worked quietly, checking the breech, inspecting the ammunition, and adjusting the camouflage net that concealed their position. Around them, British infantry units dug shallow defensive positions along the hedgerow line. Rifles and Bren guns pointed toward the mist beyond the fields. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and cordite from earlier fighting in the area. Somewhere farther down the line, artillery shells began to rumble in the distance, their distant detonations echoing faintly through the countryside. Then the sound came that everyone was listening for. The low, mechanical growl of heavy tank engines moving through the fog. It started as a faint vibration beneath the ground, barely noticeable at first, then gradually grew louder until the men along the hedgerow could feel it through the soles of their boots. German armor was approaching. Through gaps in the mist, dark shapes began to appear across the field beyond the road. At first they looked like moving shadows, indistinct against the gray morning sky. Then one of the shapes pushed forward into clearer view. Even from a distance, the tank's outline was unmistakable. The tall turret, the heavy tracks, the long 88mm gun pointing forward like the barrel of a massive rifle. A Tiger tank was advancing toward the British line. Behind the hedgerow, the gun crew watched in silence as the machine rolled slowly closer. Its armor plates were streaked with mud from previous fighting, and its engine roared steadily as it crossed the uneven ground. For a moment, the lieutenant felt the weight of the stories he had heard about this machine, the belief that nothing they had could stop it from the front. But the 17-pounder gun behind him had been built precisely to challenge that belief. And within a few minutes, the truth of that design would be tested in the most brutal way possible. The Tiger continued forward, unaware that a British gun was already waiting for it. The Tiger moved slowly through the mist, its engine rumbling with a deep mechanical rhythm that carried across the fields long before the tank itself came fully into view. To the men watching from behind the hedgerow, the sound alone was enough to tighten every nerve in their bodies. By the summer of 1944, the distinctive growl of German heavy armor had become one of the most dreaded sounds on the Western Front. British infantry had learned that when that engine noise approached, the battlefield was about to change in a way few rifles or machine guns could influence. The Tiger was not simply another armored vehicle. It was a weapon designed to dominate open ground and crush resistance through a combination of armor and firepower that most Allied weapons had struggled to counter earlier in the war. Its thick frontal plate had shrugged off countless shells, and its powerful 88mm gun could destroy Allied tanks at distances where return fire was barely possible. Many British soldiers believed that confronting a Tiger directly was not a battle of skill or courage but of simple mathematics. Its armor was thicker than the guns they carried could reliably penetrate. Behind the hedgerow, however, the gun crew of the 17-pounder had been trained for exactly this moment. Their weapon rested low against the earthen bank, its long barrel protruding through a carefully cut gap in the hedge. The camouflage net draped across the position had been arranged so that from the field ahead it looked like nothing more than tangled vegetation. The men had spent hours during the night preparing the position, digging shallow recesses for ammunition crates and adjusting the gun's angle so that it could cover the narrow strip of open ground where any advancing tank would be forced to pass. The lieutenant commanding the position had studied the terrain repeatedly under fading evening light before deciding this was the best place to wait. The hedgerows of Normandy created natural choke points where tanks could not maneuver easily. German armor advancing through the countryside often had to follow narrow roads or break through gaps between fields. Those brief moments of exposure, when a tank crossed open ground or turned slightly to navigate the hedgerow lines, were the only chances an anti-tank gun crew might have. The Tiger emerged further from the mist, its outline now unmistakable. The tank rolled forward with deliberate confidence, its tracks crushing through low vegetation and broken fence posts that lay scattered across the field. The turret moved slowly from side to side as the commander inside searched for signs of Allied positions, hidden among the hedgerows. German tank crews were experienced and cautious. They knew the dangers of advancing blindly into concealed anti-tank guns. Yet even the most careful commander could not see everything in terrain like this. The British gun position had been hidden well, and from the Tiger's approach angle the barrel of the 17-pounder was almost invisible behind the thick green wall of leaves and branches. Inside the hedgerow, the gun crew watched the tank approach with intense concentration. Each man knew his role and performed it with quiet efficiency. One soldier crouched beside the ammunition boxes, ready to lift the heavy armor-piercing rounds the moment the order was given. Another checked the elevation mechanism, ensuring the barrel was aligned perfectly with the point where the road crossed the field ahead. The loader wiped sweat from his hands despite the cool morning air, then gripped the next shell firmly so it would not slip when the time came. The metallic weight of the round felt reassuring in his palms. The 17-pounder's ammunition was designed to travel at extraordinary speed, striking enemy armor with enough force to punch through steel that earlier British guns could barely scratch. The lieutenant remained crouched behind the gun shield, binoculars pressed to his eyes. Through the lenses he could see the Tiger's details more clearly now. The heavy mantlet around the gun, the thick frontal armor plates, the commander's cupola perched on top of the turret. It looked enormous against the quiet farmland backdrop. A dark iron machine moving through a landscape that had once been peaceful. Behind the Tiger, faint shadows suggested other vehicles moving through the mist as well, though they remained indistinct for the moment. The lieutenant understood that the first shot would be crucial. If the gun revealed its position too early or missed its chance, the Tiger would respond instantly. One shell from the German tank could obliterate their position. The Tiger continued forward, its nose now approaching the small opening between two hedgerow banks where the road dipped slightly across the field. The lieutenant lowered the binoculars and spoke quietly to the gunner. "Hold it. Wait for the turn." The gunner nodded without speaking. His eye was already pressed against the sighting mechanism, tracking the tank's slow movement through the narrow field of view. The barrel of the 17-pounder moved almost imperceptibly as he adjusted the aim, aligning the gun with the path the Tiger was about to cross. The German tank reached the edge of the road and slowed slightly as it prepared to angle across the opening. That small adjustment forced the driver to turn the hull just enough to navigate the uneven ground. For a brief moment, the Tiger's frontal armor faced directly toward the hedgerow, the moment everyone had been waiting for. The lieutenant raised his hand. "Ready." The loader lifted the first round, sliding it smoothly into the open breech with practiced precision. The metal casing clicked firmly into place. Up. The breech slammed shut. The gunner steadied his breathing as he centered the sight on the Tiger's frontal plate. Through the narrow optical view, he could see the massive armored vehicle moving steadily closer, its gun still scanning the fields ahead. For years, soldiers had repeated the same claim. No British gun could stop a Tiger from the front. The lieutenant's voice came quietly but firmly. "Fire!" The gunner squeezed the trigger. The explosion from the 17-pounder shattered the quiet of the morning like a thunderclap. A violent flash erupted from the muzzle, followed instantly by the sharp recoil of the gun as the shell blasted forward at tremendous speed. Smoke and dust burst outward from the hedgerow position as the weapon discharged, revealing the hidden gun for the first time. The armor-piercing round streaked across the field in a fraction of a second and struck the Tiger's frontal armor with a blinding flash of sparks. For a brief instant, nothing seemed to happen. Then the Tiger lurched, and the belief that no British gun could stop it from the front began to collapse. The impact of the shell echoed across the field like a hammer striking an anvil. For a fraction of a second, the Tiger appeared unchanged, its massive hull still pushing forward through the mist. Then a burst of sparks and metal fragments sprayed outward from the point of impact on the frontal armor. The tank's momentum faltered, the heavy machine shuddering violently as the shock of the strike rippled through its steel frame. Inside the hedgerow, the British gun crew watched with tense silence. They had all seen shells strike German armor before and ricochet harmlessly away. Many anti-tank engagements during the war had ended that way, with Allied gunners revealing their positions only to discover that their weapons could not penetrate the enemy's protection. But something about the Tiger's reaction this time felt different. The turret jerked slightly to the side, and a thin wisp of dark smoke began leaking from a seam near the gun mantlet. The lieutenant's voice cut sharply through the moment. "Load again." The loader did not hesitate. He reached for another armor-piercing round, lifting the heavy shell from its crate with both hands and sliding it into the open breech as the gun settled back from its recoil. The metallic click of the breech closing sounded almost calm compared to the chaos that was about to unfold. Across the field, the Tiger had come to a complete stop. For a few seconds the tank sat motionless, its massive engine still rumbling but its tracks no longer moving. The commander inside had clearly realized what had happened. Somewhere hidden in the hedgerows, a British gun had just struck the front of one of the most heavily armored tanks in the German arsenal. The turret began turning slowly toward the British position, the long 88mm gun rotating with deliberate menace as the German crew tried to locate the source of the shot. The gunner behind the 17-pounder kept his eye pressed to the sight. The smoke drifting from the Tiger's armor told him the first round had done damage, but it had not yet destroyed the tank. If the German crew managed to identify the gun's location and return fire, the engagement would end instantly. One shell from the Tiger's cannon would tear through the hedgerow and scatter the gun position into fragments of earth and twisted metal. "On target," the gunner said quietly. "Fire." The second shot erupted from the gun with another thunderous blast. The recoil slammed the weapon backward again as the shell streaked across the short distance separating the two machines. This time the impact was unmistakable. The armor-piercing round struck slightly lower on the Tiger's frontal plate, and the effect was immediate. A flash of bright orange fire burst from the impact point, followed by a violent plume of smoke erupting from the turret ring. The Tiger's turret jerked violently as if struck by an invisible hammer, then froze halfway through its rotation. A moment later the tank's engine revved wildly, the driver inside apparently attempting to reverse away from the threat he could not yet see clearly. But the damage was already catastrophic. Inside the Tiger's armored hull, the second shell had punched through the thick frontal plating and exploded within the cramped interior of the fighting compartment. Fragments of steel and superheated metal tore through the tank's machinery and crew positions with devastating force. Ammunition stored within the turret ignited almost instantly, feeding the growing fire that now roared inside the tank. From the British position, the crew could see flames beginning to push outward through the seams of the turret. "Hit!" someone shouted. The lieutenant raised a hand to steady the crew. It was too early to celebrate. Even a crippled Tiger could still fire one last shot if its gun remained operational. For several seconds the tank continued to shudder as its engine screamed under full power. Then a sudden explosion ripped through the turret. The blast sent a column of black smoke surging upward into the gray sky, followed by tongues of flame licking from the hatch openings. The Tiger's engine died abruptly, the heavy machine settling into stillness in the middle of the field. Behind the hedgerow, the gun crew stared in stunned silence. They had just done something many soldiers believed was impossible. A British gun had stopped a Tiger tank from the front. But the battle was far from over. The lieutenant lifted his binoculars again and scanned the mist beyond the burning tank. Through the drifting smoke, he could now see what the earlier shadows had hinted at. The Tiger had not been alone. More German vehicles were moving forward behind it. Shapes began to emerge from the fog, half-tracks carrying infantry, followed by the darker silhouettes of additional armored vehicles advancing cautiously toward the British line. The burning Tiger now stood like a signal fire in the middle of the field, marking the exact location where the first shot had been fired. The Germans knew an anti-tank gun was hidden somewhere along the hedgerow, and they were coming to destroy it. "More armor," the lieutenant said quietly. The gun crew reacted instantly. The loader reached for another round while the gunner adjusted the sight to track the next approaching vehicle. Around them, British infantry along the hedgerow began firing rifles and Bren guns toward the advancing German troops who were now spilling into the fields behind the tanks. The quiet farmland had transformed into a battlefield in seconds. Smoke drifted across the road as the burning Tiger continued to roar with internal flames, its destruction casting flickering orange light against the gray morning mist. Beyond it, another armored vehicle pushed forward cautiously, its turret searching the hedgerows for the hidden gun that had just destroyed one of Germany's most feared machines. The lieutenant lowered the binoculars. Next target. The belief that a Tiger could not be stopped from the front had just been shattered. But the men behind the 17-pounder were about to discover that proving it once was only the beginning. The burning Tiger now dominated the battlefield like a blackened monument in the center of the field. Flames pushed steadily from the turret hatch, and thick smoke curled upward into the gray Normandy sky. For the British soldiers along the hedgerow, the destroyed tank was both a victory and a warning. It proved that the Tiger could be stopped, but it also revealed exactly where the hidden anti-tank gun was positioned. And the Germans had seen it. Beyond the wreck, movement in the mist grew sharper and more deliberate. German infantry were now spreading across the fields, advancing cautiously behind hedgerow cover and shallow drainage ditches. Several half-tracks appeared behind the ruined Tiger, their machine guns already searching the British line. Somewhere farther back, the metallic rumble of another heavy tank engine rolled through the fog like distant thunder. The lieutenant felt the shift in the battle immediately. The first shot had been an ambush. The next few minutes would be a fight for survival. "Keep low," he ordered quietly. "They know we're here now." The gunner remained steady behind the sight of the 17-pounder, adjusting the aim slightly to track the next armored vehicle approaching through the smoke. The loader crouched beside the ammunition crates, gripping another armor-piercing round while dirt and leaves drifted down from the hedge after the gun's earlier recoil. Then the German machine guns opened fire. The first bursts rattled across the hedgerow like handfuls of stones thrown against metal. Bullets tore through leaves and branches, punching holes through the camouflage net draped over the gun. The gun shield rang sharply as several rounds struck the steel plate protecting the crew. British infantry immediately returned fire. Bren guns barked from positions along the hedge line, their steady rhythm cutting through the heavier staccato bursts of German machine guns. Rifle fire cracked across the fields as British soldiers tried to slow the advancing infantry. But the real danger was still approaching. Through the drifting smoke behind the destroyed Tiger, the unmistakable silhouette of another German tank began to emerge. This one was slightly smaller. The turret shape was different, the gun shorter than the massive 88 of the Tiger. "Panzer IV," the lieutenant exhaled slowly. Against earlier British anti-tank weapons, even the Panzer IV had often been a serious threat. But the 17-pounder had been designed to destroy machines like this. Still, the gun crew had a new problem. The Panzer was no longer advancing blindly. The German tank commander had clearly seen the destruction of the Tiger ahead of him. The tank moved cautiously now, stopping periodically as the turret rotated toward likely firing positions in the hedgerows. The lieutenant knew what that meant. The next shot would not be easy. "Wait for the road crossing," he whispered. The gunner nodded, tracking the tank's movement carefully through the sight. The Panzer crept forward until it reached the wrecked Tiger, its driver steering around the burning hulk as smoke poured across the field. For a moment, the tank disappeared behind the ruined Tiger's thick plume of black smoke. Then it emerged again. The turret turned, and the long barrel of the Panzer's gun began pointing toward the hedgerow. "Now!" the lieutenant shouted. The loader slammed the shell into the breech. "Up!" The breech snapped shut. The gunner fired. The 17-pounder roared again, the muzzle blast ripping through the hedge as another high-velocity shell streaked across the short distance between the two positions. The round struck the Panzer IV's frontal armor just below the turret. This time the effect was immediate. The shell punched straight through the tank's front plate with devastating force. Inside the vehicle, fragments of steel and molten metal exploded through the fighting compartment. The Panzer lurched violently as the driver lost control. For a moment the tank continued rolling forward. Then the tracks locked suddenly. Smoke burst from the engine deck, followed seconds later by flames pushing through the turret, hatch as the crew inside struggled to escape. One of the German soldiers climbed halfway out before collapsing back into the turret as fire spread through the interior. The second tank was finished. But the battlefield had grown far more dangerous. German infantry had now pushed close enough to the hedgerow to begin throwing grenades toward British positions. Bullets snapped through branches above the gun crew as the firefight intensified along the entire defensive line. Behind the second burning tank, more vehicles were moving. Half-tracks, infantry carriers, and somewhere beyond them, the distant growl of another heavy engine still echoed through the mist. The lieutenant raised his binoculars once more. Through the drifting smoke, he could see another large silhouette moving slowly across the field behind the advancing infantry. Another Tiger. The destruction of the first two tanks had not stopped the German advance. It had only forced them to commit even more armor. Behind the hedgerow, the British gun crew understood what that meant. They had already destroyed two vehicles. But now the Germans knew exactly where the gun was. And the next Tiger would not approach blindly. The lieutenant lowered the binoculars slowly. Around him the battle had become chaotic. Rifle fire cracking along the hedge, Bren guns rattling through the smoke, and German machine guns hammering the position from multiple angles. But the 17-pounder still stood ready. The loader lifted another shell. The gunner adjusted the sight. Across the field, the second Tiger rolled steadily forward through the smoke and fire. This time it was coming directly for them. The second Tiger came through the smoke like a moving fortress. Unlike the first tank, which had advanced confidently into the hedgerow trap, this one approached with deliberate caution. Its commander had clearly witnessed the destruction ahead. The burned-out hulks of the first Tiger and the Panzer IV now littered the field between the German line and the British position, their twisted metal frames still burning fiercely. The wrecks sent thick black smoke drifting across the battlefield, partially obscuring the hedgerow where the British gun was hidden. But the German crew understood exactly what had happened. Somewhere inside that hedgerow, a powerful anti-tank gun was waiting. The Tiger slowed as it rolled forward, its turret sweeping carefully from left to right as the gunner searched for any sign of the weapon that had destroyed the tanks ahead of them. Through the mist and smoke, the massive 88mm cannon now pointed directly toward the British line. Behind the hedgerow, the gun crew felt the pressure of the moment immediately. The earlier shots had been ambushes, brief opportunities where the Germans had not yet identified the threat. Now the situation was entirely different. The Tiger's gun was already aimed toward their position, and its armor was thick enough that even the powerful 17-pounder would have little margin for error. One mistake would end the fight instantly. The lieutenant crouched beside the gun shield, watching the approaching tank through binoculars while the rest of the crew prepared another round. "Steady," he said quietly. The loader lifted the next shell from the ammunition crate. The heavy armor-piercing round felt even heavier now, the weight of it carrying the understanding that this shot might decide whether they survived the next few seconds. Across the field, German infantry continued advancing cautiously behind the burning tanks. Several soldiers had already reached shallow drainage ditches closer to the British hedgerow, using them as cover while machine gunners set up positions to suppress the Allied defenders. Rifle fire crackled along the line as British infantry tried to hold them back. But the Tiger ignored the infantry fight. Its attention remained fixed on the hedgerow. The turret stopped rotating. The long barrel of the 88 settled into position. The lieutenant saw the movement immediately. "They've got us," he said. The gunner remained calm behind the sight, tracking the Tiger's approach through the narrow optical view. The tank filled more and more of the scope as it moved closer across the uneven ground. The loader slid the round into the breech. Up! The breech slammed shut with a sharp metallic snap. For a brief moment the battlefield seemed to narrow into silence. The gunner could see the Tiger's frontal plate clearly now. Even from a distance, the thickness of the armor was obvious. The earlier shot had penetrated the first Tiger through a combination of speed, impact angle, and the sheer power of the 17-pounder shell. But this time the German crew was ready. Inside the Tiger's turret, the gunner had also spotted movement in the hedgerow. The barrel of the 88 shifted slightly. The lieutenant understood exactly what that meant. If the German gun fired first, the 17-pounder position would be obliterated. "Fire!" The British gun roared. The 17-pounder recoiled violently as the shell blasted forward through the drifting smoke. At almost the same instant, the Tiger fired. The German 88mm cannon erupted with a massive flash, sending its own shell screaming toward the hedgerow. The two shots crossed the field in opposite directions within fractions of a second. The British round struck first. The armor-piercing shell slammed into the Tiger's frontal plate just to the right of the main gun mantlet. Sparks exploded outward in a brilliant shower of white metal fragments as the round punched through the thick armor. Inside the tank, the shell tore through the fighting compartment with devastating force. The effect was immediate. The Tiger's turret jerked violently as flames burst from the turret ring and commander's hatch. The engine screamed as the driver instinctively tried to reverse away from the threat, but the damage inside the tank had already begun to cascade through its systems. But the German shot had already been fired. The 88mm shell struck the hedgerow with terrifying force. The explosion tore a massive hole through the earthen bank just yards from the gun position. Dirt, branches, and shattered wood blasted outward in a violent wave that knocked several members of the gun crew off their feet. The concussion rang through the air like thunder. For a moment, the entire battlefield disappeared behind a cloud of dust and debris. When the smoke cleared, the British gun still stood. The 17-pounder had survived the near miss. Across the field, the Tiger's fate was now unmistakable. Flames poured from the turret hatch as the tank rolled backward a few yards before its tracks locked completely. The turret stopped moving, frozen at an awkward angle while thick smoke billowed into the sky. The second Tiger was finished. Behind the hedgerow, the gun crew slowly lifted themselves from the ground, stunned but alive. The lieutenant wiped dirt from his face and looked back across the field. 3 armored vehicles now burned in the open farmland. The belief that no British gun could stop a Tiger frontally had just been shattered twice within minutes. But the battle around them had not yet ended. German infantry still moved cautiously through the smoke, their attack continuing even as the wrecked tanks burned in front of them. The lieutenant looked back at his crew. Keep loading. The 17-pounder had already rewritten what soldiers believed about the Tiger. But the men behind it still had a battlefield to hold. The battlefield began to change in a way that every experienced soldier could recognize immediately. Momentum had shifted. Across the open field, the burning wrecks of the 3 German vehicles now formed a jagged line of black smoke and twisted metal. The first Tiger still burned fiercely, its turret scorched and partially blown open by the internal explosion. Beside it, the Panzer sat crippled in the dirt, its engine deck engulfed in orange flames. And farther behind them, the second Tiger, once advancing with deadly confidence, now stood motionless, its turret frozen at an awkward angle while thick black smoke poured steadily into the gray Normandy sky. For the German infantry advancing behind the armor, the sight was unmistakable. Their breakthrough had collapsed. Only minutes earlier, the attack had seemed carefully organized. Heavy armor had pushed forward first, clearing the road and forcing Allied infantry to retreat while supporting troops moved behind them. That tactic had worked repeatedly across the Eastern Front and in earlier battles against Allied positions. But here, in this narrow strip of farmland, something had gone wrong. The Tiger tanks, machines that were supposed to dominate the battlefield, had been destroyed one after another before they could even reach the hedgerow. The German infantry hesitated. Some soldiers continued firing toward the British line, their rifles cracking through the smoke as they searched for the hidden gun that had caused the destruction ahead. But the advance has slowed dramatically now. Without armored support pushing forward, the infantry were suddenly exposed in the open fields. Behind the hedgerow, British Bren guns took advantage of the moment. The steady rattle of automatic fire cut across the fields as British infantry poured rounds into the advancing German formations. Riflemen along the hedge fired carefully from shallow positions dug into the earth, their shots echoing sharply against the distant thunder of artillery farther along the front. The German half-tracks that had been following the Tiger tanks now stopped abruptly. Their commanders understood the danger immediately. Moving forward meant driving directly into the same hidden anti-tank gun that had already destroyed 3 armored vehicles in less than 10 minutes. The half-tracks reversed slowly, disappearing back into the drifting mist as the German attack faltered. Behind the hedgerow, the British gun crew remained at their weapon, still half covered in dirt and debris from the near miss of the Tiger's final shot. The loader wiped mud from his hands and reached for another round out of instinct more than necessity. The gunner remained behind the sight, scanning the smoke-filled field in case another armored vehicle appeared. But none came. For several minutes, the battlefield settled into the uneasy rhythm that often followed a failed assault. Sporadic rifle fire continued along the hedgerow, and distant artillery shells rolled across the countryside like muted thunder. But the German armor had stopped. The lieutenant slowly raised his binoculars once more and studied the scene beyond the field. The Tiger wrecks continued burning. The infantry who had been advancing moments earlier were now pulling back toward the cover of distant tree lines and farm buildings. Whatever plan the German commanders had begun that morning had clearly been abandoned. The British defensive line had held, and the 17-pounder gun sitting quietly behind the hedgerow had been the reason. The lieutenant lowered the binoculars and looked back at his crew. None of them spoke for a moment. The adrenaline that had carried them through the engagement was fading now, leaving behind the strange quiet that often followed intense combat. The loader sat beside the ammunition crates, breathing slowly while staring at the smoke rising from the destroyed tanks. The gunner leaned back from the sight, rubbing dust from his eyes as he watched the distant German withdrawal. For years, soldiers across Europe had repeated the same belief. No British gun could stop a Tiger tank from the front. The Tiger had earned that reputation through hard experience. Its thick armor and powerful gun had dominated earlier engagements, forcing Allied forces to rely on flanking maneuvers, artillery, or air support to destroy it. But weapons evolve in war. So do the men who fight with them. The 17-pounder had been designed specifically to confront the growing threat of German heavy armor. Its long barrel and powerful high-velocity shells gave British forces a weapon capable of striking with enough force to penetrate even the strongest enemy machines. Still, design alone does not win battles. The weapon must be placed correctly. The crew must remain steady under pressure. And sometimes a few seconds of courage determine whether a battlefield legend survives or collapses. That morning in Normandy, behind a hedgerow that looked no different from 100 others scattered across the French countryside, a British gun crew had challenged the reputation of one of the most feared tanks of the war. And they had proven something that many soldiers had begun to doubt. The Tiger was not invincible, could be stopped, could be destroyed. And when the smoke finally cleared from the field, the wrecks of 2 Tiger tanks and a Panzer IV stood as silent proof that the belief had been wrong all along. The men behind the 17-pounder did not celebrate loudly. They simply reloaded their guns and waited, because they knew the war in Normandy was far from over. But from that moment forward, the reputation of the British 17-pounder would spread through Allied ranks just as quickly as the myth of the Tiger once had. And the next time German armor rolled toward a British position, the men behind those guns would remember what had happened in that field. The Tiger could be beaten. Someone had already proven it.